As regards climate impact, and I'll talk about climate impact rather than climate change, for one important reason is that currently most rural road networks are not resilient to current climate. There is what I would call a climate resilience deficit in rural road networks. Climate impacts upon rural roads in a much relatively higher way than higher designed roads. It's a fact of life. There's less money for roads. These rural roads, they are built to a lower standard than highways. Therefore, climate impacts are higher. They are what we call more vulnerable to climate impact. So rural road networks are generally more vulnerable to climate impact than high volume roads.
Climate change is almost certainly happening. The difficulty when you try to apply it is that nobody knows how it's happening or what's going to be the timescale for it or exactly what's going to happen.
Climate change is going to be important. It's already having some impact on rural roads. Mainly when you're talking about an unpaved road, as most engineers who get involved in this say, number one thing you think about is not how many vehicles are passing, but how much rainfall is there? How are you going to control the drainage? And of course, climate change, the biggest impacts are coming in terms of more intense rainfall, not just larger amounts but more erratic and more intense. And this means that do we need to be having even more attention on the drainage system? Should we be having bigger margins of safety on the culvert design, cross drainage design?
Now, one of the issues we have to deal with in talking about wanting climate resilient roads, people talk about we must make our roads climate resilient, but there is very little as yet research done on what do you mean by climate resilient?
I think one of the major developments that will influence the development of the sector in future is with regard to the major issue of climate change, and with the expected increased frequency of storms and droughts and higher temperatures and propensity to flooding and so on, and makes us very much aware that we have to do a lot more to make our rural roads more climate resilient.
You know, we used to say, well, you could design for dry climate and so on in arid areas, and that's beneficial in terms of the use of materials, for example. But now if extreme events are going to be more frequent, it has implications. And one of the big debates in terms of the engineering at the moment is whether it's cheaper to actually allow those events to happen, and whatever the consequences are, pay for them, obviously, and do the repairs, or whether you actually upgrade everything to a different standard to be able to cope with these extreme events. That's going to be a major challenge in the future.
I think the whole world are now facing with climate change, and then the climate change happened unexpectedly, and it impact to the rural transport infrastructure heavily. I say heavily because the infrastructure for rural area, they are very fragile. I say fragile because rural transport road, for instance, it was built to support the accessibility rather than to cope with the severe climate change.
No country can afford to have its total network totally resilient to resist any climate impact. So we need to think about levels of resilience. Your highways, highly resilient perhaps, to all but the highest storms. Provincial network, a step down, rural network, a step down again. The way we're thinking about it and the way forward is, do we need to define perhaps rural networks may be allowable to have 1 or 2 days a year, several days a year, where the road may be cut. So you may not be designing totally climate resilient bridges, but going for climate resilient causeways that may be overtopped for 2, 3, 4 days a week a year.
Everywhere you get flooding, everywhere you get bridges overtopped or washed away or whatever, because at every stage of development over the last 500 years or whatever, engineers have been building things without adequate data on the extreme events that could happen within the lifetime of their structures. So we haven't even got it right for the current climate, let alone what might get worse in the future. So climate change is real, but climate resilience is something that we're not even doing now, and we're unlikely to get it right for the future.